27 years into our democracy, the day-to-day experience for thousands of black pupils in our schools remains gloomy. Inequality and racism persists, with many still being insulted about their natural hair. Now, we've recently seen pupils and parents at the Cornwall Hill College in Irene protest against racism. To speak to us more about these challenges in general, we're joined now by activist and author Zulaikha Patel. Zulaikha, thanks so much for your time. Of course, you made headlines 5 years ago speaking out against your school's hair policy. It's still happening. Are you actually surprised, or did you expect this slow pace of transformation?
Very good evening to you, Shahan. Thank you for having me. First and foremost, I cannot say that I am surprised, because this isn't a matter that just stems back to just 2016. It's been 27 years, and we've been delaying transformation, and we've been delaying change. It's been over 2 decades now, and so I can't quite say that I'm surprised. And there's a lot of layers as to why change has been delayed. And hopefully we can get into those layers in this discussion. Those layers form around, number one, there isn't accountability structures in holding elected officials accountable to doing the work in which they're elected to do, and the work that they promise to fulfill. There isn't accountability structures, because you've had over a decade now. There's been 27 years. Issues like this shouldn't have come into our democracy in the first place. These are issues that should have been tabled in the very same negotiation meetings when you were negotiating in Codesa. These are issues that should have been tabled then. And so there aren't accountability structures. That's one of the layers. And secondly, there aren't accountability structures for racist people. They understand that they're able to do such, and are able to not face any form of disciplinary action, and so it allows them to be comfortable in such behavior and such discrimination towards black children, because they know that there isn't disciplinary action which they're going to face. And number two, also the understanding of the problem. I think we've got a large problem in understanding the root. We're not grasping the problem from the root. And the root of the problem is that there hasn't been enough redress from the discriminatory laws and practices which stem from our very recent past under the apartheid legacy. As we all know, that regime was what built inequality in the education arena through the Bantu Education Act of 1953. So that was where inequality was constructed, and there hasn't been enough redress to address those inequalities. And what we've seen is merely just a desegregation of schools. Like, you can attend any school as any school, and all schools are open to all races. However, the very foundation, the exclusionary foundation, that foundation which was built by racist leaders of that past regime, still remains within the foundation of the education system, and we haven't seen enough redress.
I heard one of the pupils cry, talking about a teacher making her feel like her natural hair wasn't good enough. You went through something similar, of course. Is it fair to say she's going to feel insecure about this for a long time?
Yes, of course it is. I mean, during 2016, when we had to speak about the issues that we'd faced at the time, we had people who matriculated years before us, who had matriculated even about 10 years before us, and would still say that those very same racist and derogatory insults they received are things that have traumatized them into their adulthood. And for me, from a personal perspective, I still find trouble in navigating, trying to heal from those incidents, and so it's going to take years. It's something that takes years, and you don't get to a point where you say you're completely over it. I think we tend to take away the actual trauma that lies in experiencing racism. It's a very traumatic experience in its own.
It definitely is, right? But overcoming this racism is key, of course, to putting those racist people in a corner, not giving them the power that they currently have. So let's talk about rebuilding self-worth. You've also written a book to inspire young people. How do you go about doing that?
So how I've gone about doing that was I began writing the book when I was in grade 11, and my publishers had reached out to me at the time, and they initially wanted me to write a children's book. And when I got the offer to write a children's book, I asked myself, what was the one thing that I would have loved to hear as a child, and what is the one thing I would have loved to hear as a young black girl child? And I knew that if there was one thing I wanted to hear was an affirmation of my existence, an affirmation of my blackness and my existence as a young black girl child. And so I knew that I would write a story that would affirm the existence of a young black girl child. And so through that, I also began to find some parts of healing through writing the book, and it made me also find more confidence in my own self-worth. And I do hope that the book lives on for centuries to come, and it's a permanent reference for black girls to know that they're worthy and that they are valid in every single measure. They are valid.
Yeah. So let's go back to the lack of accountability you mentioned at the start of this conversation. Of course, the Education Department is saying that they are encouraging transformation at schools. In fact, it must happen, but this is still happening in 2021. When it comes to the curriculum at schools, how does that change, and how would you recommend it change to actually deal with discrimination, and not just only by teachers, educating learners about this, but teachers themselves educating themselves, because that's where it stems from, right? We're seeing racist teachers making pupils feel this way.
Mm-hmm. That's a very key question that you asked. I think, firstly, we need to also just place an emphasis on the fact that we've come to a point in the country where we can no longer just continue to merely highlight these issues, and here we have another one to write in the books to highlight. We should take this as a turning point for immediate and urgent radical transformation. It cannot be something where we still have to discuss whether or not we are looking into transformation. And just on the point of transformation, I think with recently what I heard the Department of Education speak about was the fact that they're looking to a future of non-racialism. I think that non-racialism is not enough. We need to look to a future that is anti-racist. We cannot allow room for racism to breathe or exist, and non-racialism is not enough. And so how I would suggest the beginning of that turning point is in restructuring the curriculum. It all goes back to the decolonization of education. We tend to think that decolonization is only going to benefit the black community, where in actual fact it's going to benefit society at large. Even white individuals themselves are going to benefit from decolonized education. And where you begin is that in the education curriculum, racism is taught as a thing of the past, and it is taught as something that we've overcome already, and we're not taught what it still looks like today. And so I believe that children still need to be taught what it looks like today, so that they're able to find ways to challenge it, and they understand their surroundings and the reality that they live in, and they understand, and they're not blindfolded by the fact that racism is a thing of the past which we've overcome, because we haven't.
Yeah.
And it also begins in the fact that we need to have an education curriculum which is representative of what our country is. We still deal with the fact that African languages are not part of the education system, which I think in 2021, 27 years into our democracy, isn't something that we can still discuss and debate about. I think that this should be the turning point where we begin to include African languages in the curriculum to be taught as subject, which will carry the very same importance which subjects such as English and Afrikaans carry. Because in that, then there is a psychological effect where someone then begins to see that Africanness is worthy and it is valid, and they see the worth in it. Because when you do not include something and children do not see that, already they become conditioned to see it as insignificant. And when it is there and they understand that it carries the very same importance, then they begin to understand that it's important and it's valid, and automatically there's a psychological change. And also in the fact that we need to begin to restructure the life orientation curriculum in its own. I believe that it's about time that children are taught about the Constitution. They're taught that the very same things that they speak about and they write memorandums about are in the Constitution itself. Section 29 speaks on education, it speaks on redress, and also restructuring the life orientation curriculum to teach children about the injustices that exist in the world, which will enable them and propel them to want to become solution creators to those injustices once they leave the schooling environment. And not just wait till they leave the schooling environment, but begin to think about those even now. Even the history curriculum definitely has to include more Black history, because we have to have children understand that as a Pan-Africanist myself, we have to teach children to understand that Africa was way more before slavery, and they cannot just only see themselves in that light. They need to see themselves in the greatness that Africa was in a pre-colonial history. And not just that, but they need to begin to see African and Black victories as well. I think far too many times in the teaching of Black history, we leave out and exclude Black victories and Black victories and Black wins. And that is an important and critical part of teaching Black history, because I believe that as Black people, we are way more than just our suffering and our pain. And so it has to begin in education and in the decolonization of education. And I think that is something that we need to make a national priority. And I say this because education is socialization. Education is at the center of everything in society, because it teaches people how to respond, how to react. And if it's a way that people are socializing how to be people and how to exist in the everyday world, then it carries so much importance that it enriches one, and it isn't just what I would describe as colonial and suppressive. It needs to be enriching and liberating. And so the decolonization of our education curriculum needs to become a national priority.
Yeah, I want to say preach, honey, preach, because that's what you're doing. Let's talk about parenting, because, that's also very important. Now, teachers can obviously teach children at a very young age how to stand up for their rights, but parents play a very important role in molding the personalities of their kids and how bold they are. They have the power to make sure that their children will not stand for racism in school, will tell a teacher that you can't tell me anything about my hair because I'm proud of who I am, I'm proud of my skin, my body, my hair, everything. That also must be important, isn't it?
Of course it is. Of course it is. I mean, in the very ages before one goes to school are very critical times, because they begin to see the world and they're quite curious. And so I think that it needs to begin at home, in parents empowering their children to see themselves as valid and to not take shame in who they are, particularly for Black children. They need to see their identities as valid and as valid and significant and not as inferior, and that begins at home. And they also need to, I think it's very critical in the era that we are in as a country, that parents begin to also teach their children that we're not necessarily at the destination of freedom, because freedom isn't a destination, and every generation has its own mission to fulfill in terms of freedom, and we haven't reached the destination of freedom. And I think it's very important for parents to highlight to their children that we're not yet at that destination, and not necessarily allow for their children to be blindfolded by the ignorance that lies in the term born free, because we're not fully free from the shackles that have once oppressed our country.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate your insight. Zulaikha Patel, activist and author.